Get us started today. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is in your handout, I've put an extended section of a review in there. I'm not going through all of that today, but it's for you. You can take a look at it a little bit later. Gives you a little bit of review and gives you a little bit of background of Daniel that we'll be talking about when we get there in just a little bit. But we do start off with this idea of imaging God because that is our mission. It is our purpose. It's what we want to focus on when we come to church. We want to learn about it here and practice it when we go out. So I put in that our mission is to equip and train people to image God at all times in every situation. And that's going to come back over and over a little bit today. So our mission, we want to image God at all times and in every situation. So you might recall how we arrived at this. How did we get to talking about imaging God? Why did that become a thing for us? Because we took this from Genesis chapter number 1, verses 26 and 27. And that's where we find God saying, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. When we come to that section, we realize that's who we are. That's what God created us to be. Now, it's not his hope for us. It's what we were actually designed to be, image bearers of God. If you walk through the review at a later time that's in your papers, you'll kind of see, remembering some of the things of who we are, what we were created to do. What does it mean to image God? Imaging God means that we actually represent God here on earth. The best example of that is when Jesus was on earth and he told Thomas, if any man has seen me, he has seen what? The Father. Jesus was imaging God on earth. What did he mean by that? Did he mean that when you look into the face of God, he's going to look like what Jesus physically looked like? No, he talks about the character. When we've looked at Jesus, we've looked into the character of God, the image of who he was. And when we are following Jesus, we're going to be image bearers of him, and he's the image of God. So our whole purpose in life is to be image bearers. Now, it's a very difficult thing to do. Our goal is to image him when? At all times. Where? In every situation. Now, I just want to review that for a second. Our purpose and goal is to image God at all times and in every situation. That doesn't leave a back door. It doesn't leave a loophole. There's no workaround for all this stuff. And this means that we have to be on and doing it right all the time. And we've already discovered that we kind of struggle and we fail with that. You know, when we started really focusing on imaging God, we started realizing how much we fail at imaging God, didn't we? You know, the week that we took home the thing, we started writing down, how did I image God? Where did I fail to image God? You remember doing that? And all of a sudden it kind of made us more aware of, wow, I got a lot of work to do. And so we kind of seen that. Even though we're created to image God, when sin came in, that's what disrupted everything. That's what changed it all and marred the image. So in order to be successful, we have to rely on God. But I want to make clear that relying on God does not mean we're passive in the situation. In other words, we don't get to say, God, I didn't image you in that situation, but that's because, I was willing, but you didn't do it. You just didn't infuse me with it and move my hands and mouth. No, we're not passive in this. So I wrote this in. It is my responsibility to make the effort, and it's God's role to take the effort and make it successful. So what do we mean by that? It means I have to be responsible for making the effort to image God. I can't expect God to just come work in me and through me, and I'm not making the effort to do it. So I think sometimes as Christians, people think, I'm here, and whatever God does, like if I act a certain way, well, that's just who I am. God didn't change me. Now we have to make the effort to make these decisions and to do these things and do them the right way. But we trust God to take that effort and make it successful. Now, God has provided us with some examples. We've already seen Jesus as one example. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So he gives us some examples, but the examples are not just there for us to look at and go, oh, well, I'm glad they did it. It's to show us that it's not impossible to do. So if we just put Jesus up there and say he's the example, then we go, what? Well, he was God. It was easy for him to image God. So, that's not what real life is about. So some of the other examples that God has given to us, and one of them would be a man named Daniel. Daniel from the Bible. Most Christians are aware of Daniel and kind of familiar with at least one story related to Daniel. You know what story I'm talking about, right? Yeah, Daniel in the lion's den. I mean, that's one of the most famous ones. If you talk about Daniel, that's probably the image that comes to your mind. The book of Daniel is so much bigger than that one event. And we're going to not go through the whole book of Daniel, but we're going to learn some lessons about Daniel and how he imaged God. So he's a great example because he imaged God in a pagan land. Now let that sink in for us. He was imaging God in a pagan land. Pagan meaning an ungodly land, people that weren't following God. So when we kind of look at that, we realize that it can be done. Think about it this way. When we stand before God and we try to say, I tried, but it just didn't happen. All he's got to do is look to Daniel and say, he did it. And that's what these examples are going to be in life. Now, he's not the only example, but he's one we'll take a look at today. So even though we are familiar with the story of Daniel in the lion's den, I want you to remember that his story started long before the lion's den. The lion's den was actually when he was older in life. And when we first read about Daniel, he's actually very young. And here's some things to know about him. I put three types. He's a Hebrew, he's a Jew, he's an Israelite. That's not really three different things, but it kind of tells us as a Hebrew, as a Jew, that's going to be his race. That's going to be sort of his ethnicity, if you would. Israelite is going to be his nationality. He belongs to the nation of Israel. So all of these things kind of just basically tell us that he's in this family, a descendant of Abraham. But it also appears that Daniel was in the royal family. I don't know if you are aware of that or not. Daniel was most likely in the royal family somewhere. I don't think that he was set to be king. He wasn't necessarily a prince, but he was somewhere belonging into the royal family. And I'll show you that in just a little while when we read about some of it. But Daniel, he may have found it easier to image God when he was in the royal family, serving in the royal court maybe, in all the comforts and in all the protection and in a place that was godly. Would you agree that that was probably an easier time for Daniel? And so we could look at Daniel and start off and say, okay, well, he's got all these special privileges, so it's easier for him to do that. But we're going to find that Daniel is actually going to image God also in a pagan land. So it may have been easy for him. And you and I are not royalty, but I want to remind us that we actually live in a place that has a greater Christian culture. Even though we're losing, I see we're moving towards more of what we would think of as a post-Christian nation. But we still live in a place that has more Christian principles, rules, freedoms than a lot of people in the world. So we are a little privileged as well. But the question is going to be, can Daniel and would Daniel image God in a non-Christian, a pagan place? The question is also going to be could you and I image God in a post-Christian nation? Meaning that time of the freedoms, that time of the popularity, that time of when it was easy is past. So let's talk about Daniel's situation as it changed. Before we jump into reading the Bible and tell about him, let's talk about how his situation changed. When Daniel was a young man, probably in his teens, the king of Babylon, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar, and you can try to pronounce that really fast and say that a couple different times, Nebuchadnezzar. I would love to hear how the kids would say that. We ought to get them on recordings trying to get that one out. Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon, and he's going to invade Jerusalem. He's going to set up camp around them, besiege them, eventually take over, and God is actually going to give the nation of Israel into the hands of Babylon. Why does he do that? Because the nation of Israel had actually turned away from God. They had gotten unfaithful in serving God, and so they were serving idols. They still served God in practice, but they were serving idols as well. And so God turns them over to the king of Babylon. And when he does this, Nebuchadnezzar orders his generals to bring from Jerusalem certain people, captives, hostages. And he orders them a certain way. He wants them to be, some of the young men who were, in essence, basically good looking, smart, the best that this city had to offer. And he's going to bring them out, and they were going to learn the Babylonian language, their customs, and all the advanced teaching of Babylon. Now, there's a couple reasons for this captivity or these hostages, if you would think of them that way. One of them could actually be to keep the resistance down and the rebellion down. So you take these hostages of the royal family and certain people. Now the city doesn't want to jeopardize their life, their health. And so they kind of get in line and obey. They don't revolt as much. Also, as I already said, to train them to serve for the king. And it's possible that his goal was to actually send them back, because this was a practice as well. You educate them, you train them, you get them under the culture, and now you send them back as sort of to rule over that area. They have the customs, the language of the people, they have the influence with the people, and you sort of serve as a liaison in between. So those are some possible things that was taking part during all of this. So let's take a look at, before we read the chapter, here's the things we'll cover today. 3 facts about imaging God. Since we're learning about it, here's some facts we can learn today. First of all, imaging God travels, and we'll talk about what that means. Imaging God travails, and as far as I know, I spelled that right. I Googled it a couple times to make sure that it's spelled right, because it just doesn't look right to me. And imaging God triumphs. So I'm going to ask you real quick just to look with me. Let's say these together, because this is what we're going to try to drill in today. Imaging God travels, imaging God travails, and imaging God triumphs. Let's read the chapter number 1 of the book of Daniel. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God. And notice that it is God that gave that over to him. God is always in control of countries, nations, militaries, whatever is happening, God is the one that allows it to happen. It says, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So he takes the holy things from the temple to his country and puts them in his temples as a shrine to his gods. And the king spake unto Aspenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning of the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among them were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them by different names. Unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. So he's changing their names. He gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Now that's a name that has never gotten said right? Abednego. We always struggle with that one. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your swords? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all of his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of the king of Cyrus. And so we're going to talk about Daniel's journey and how his life changed all of a sudden. He went from this privileged position as a young man in the king's family, in the royal court, and he ends up now in a place where he's a captive. He's being trained in a new culture, and we're going to talk about all those things. What does Daniel do? We believe by following Daniel's life, he was imaging God where he lived. When he was a young man, in the king's court, in the family, in the privileged position that he was in the nation of Israel, he was imaging God. How do we know that? Because that's what he continues to do even when things change. So let's talk first of all about imaging God travels. What does that mean? It means that it goes with you, right? Wherever you go. It travels. It's not confined to a geographical location. You are aware of this. There are people that you probably know. Their Christianity does not travel. It doesn't leave their church most of the time. You understand what I'm saying? They're Christian in church. They sing, they pray, they praise, they talk about God, but their Christianity, their faith, imaging God, does not travel. Now, there are people that we would also say as Christians, they would not go outside of church and totally, you think of them being different, but they don't image God there. I mean, just think about it. We're learning more about imaging God. We're learning how much we fail to image God. But it travels. It goes with you. It is at all times and what? In every situation. I heard it whispered out there just a little bit. Traveling. It goes with you. Did it go with Daniel? Yes. When Daniel ends up in a different place, when he ends up in a whole different country and a different situation, his whole life has changed. There was something about him that was the same. He still imaged God. Daniel's looking at this situation, and he's given to him and his companions this meat to eat from the king, the wine from the king. And you might question, like, why? Why would Daniel not eat this stuff? There were some things that Jewish dietary law did not allow them to eat. There's also these meats that were from the foreign land. They would offer these things first to their idols. It was offered up to them. And Daniel saw this as a problem. And Daniel said, I don't want to defile myself before God, but yet I'm under the rulership of another king. So how do I make this work? What do I do? His first instinct was not to cause a rebellion. That's pretty good, isn't it? Daniel understood what God had done in this situation. He understood what it means to image God. And Daniel's goal was not to show his defiance to the king. It was to show his allegiance to his God. And Daniel decided, I don't want to defile myself. I don't want to dishonor God in this. I want God to be glorified. So he went about it the right way. Whenever we're in a situation that is not right, we still have to go about it the right way if we're going to honor God. So Daniel doesn't just image God in Jerusalem when everything's going well. He images God in another land when everything is difficult. It goes with you wherever you are at all times in every situation. Ask yourself this question. Do I image God at all times in every situation, or do I have certain places picked out where I really focus on imaging God and certain places where I just let that slip, or I just don't practice that? We've had people through the years that, church knows them one way, and everyone outside of church knows them a different way. And those two people don't match up. Like a split personality, aren't they? They talk godly. They appear to be godly. But it doesn't travel with them. Their family don't know them to be honest, upright, wholesome, trustworthy, humble. Their co-workers don't know them to be that way. The waitresses and waiters and the restaurant people don't know them to be that way. Hey, isn't it true that if we're going to image God, it needs to be at all times and in every place, always? Isn't that true? If not, what are we doing? So we begin to ask ourselves that, and Daniel begins to look at these things. I want to talk about what Daniel is different about his life right now. First of all, he is taken from his home. Daniel's not in his home. Think about this. When Nebuchadnezzar finally broke through in Jerusalem, after being besieging the city for a while, when he finally broke through and he made the order and he told his generals, you bring the hostages, you bring these people, I want this kind of person, the young men that are good looking, the ones that are smart, the ones that we can use in this service. And they came and they placed Daniel and his friends in the shackles and they began to carry them away. Daniel never saw his home again. What if you never saw the home that you left this morning again? Daniel never slept in his own bed, in his room. Never told his parents good night again. He was gone from his home. He was gone from his family. Daniel never celebrated a Mother's Day or a Father's Day with his family again. Never celebrated a birthday with his family. Everything has changed. He was gone also from his country. He wasn't in the same country anymore. He wouldn't be able to sing the national anthems and the songs of praise to his country. He would never celebrate an Independence Day or another time that he looked back on. He could never say, I am an Israelite, I have these rights. Daniel was a captive in another country, away from his home, away from his family, with a new culture. He was away from his place of privilege. Back home, Daniel was, as far as we know, seen because they took him, they gave the specifications of who they wanted. They took Daniel, gives us the idea that he was in the royal family somewhere. That had to come with some privilege, right? Just something better than just the other people that didn't have. But you know what Daniel was in Babylon? When he enters in, when we read this story, he's a hostage. He's not special. He's no better than all the others. He's no different. Yet his imaging of God traveled. He was out from his place of worship. He was no longer, Daniel would never again enter into the temple and worship God in the holy city. He's going to grow to be a very old man, but he'll never walk back into that place again. What if we walk out of this church today and it's the last time that we're ever able to enter into church and worship God? Would imaging God still travel with you? Would it travel with me? Would we and could we practice imaging God when all of these things are changed in our life? I've known people whose family does not know that they act very different when they're away from home. Very different when they're in different places. There's this idea that when you travel geographically and you leave, it's okay to be different than you are back home. But the idea is that when we're imaging God, what? It's supposed to be the same at all times and what? In every situation. Yeah, y'all got better with that one. Appreciate it. All times, every situation, we're imaging God. So it travels. It has to travel, or else it's not real. Also notice that imaging God travails. Now, what does travail mean? I gave you a definition of that in your notes there. It means painful or laborious effort. Well, that doesn't sound like any fun at all, does it? Painful or laborious effort. Imaging God is not easy. We've already learned that it's not easy. We've already learned that we have to depend on God in order to help this, to actually make it happen. But it's an intentional action that has to take place inside of us. It is something that's painful at times. How do I know that? Well, just think about it. What do we learn about imaging God? Jesus, we're going to be like him. He was humble. What happened when Jesus was standing before the people that, the government that wanted to kill him? He opened not his mouth. He was like a lamb, the Bible says, dumb before his shears, meaning silent. Jesus is known for his meekness. It's not easy being a Christian and battling our pride, is it? Because our pride wants us to respond a certain way. But when we want to image God, it says you can't image God. You can't be like that. Because that's not what God's like. We started walking through the book of Galatians and chapter 5, verses 22. We learned that the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness, meekness, goodness, temperance. That takes effort, doesn't it? So we find that it's painful. It's laborious effort. There's an intention that has to take place inside of us. Daniel and his friends made a conscious decision to image God. Think about when they got there. They actually had a decision to make. We might not think about them making a decision, but the Bible says this is the meat that's given to them. This is what's required of them. And then they decide, you know what? I guess we're going to have to make a decision. I don't feel right about this. This isn't what we should do. And so they decide to make an effort, and they decide this effort might cost us something. Here's some things that it may have cost them. First of all, they forfeited comforts. Don't you think it would have been a lot easier to eat the meat of the king? The king's meat's not leftovers. It's the good stuff. What did the king want? He wanted people standing before him that were at their prime. So he wasn't cutting corners. He was giving them the best of the foods so they would be the best of themselves. Daniel said, just give us beans. You ever eating something and you look over and someone else is eating something a lot better than what you got? Okay, have you ever tried to diet and you're trying to eat your diet food and someone else sitting over just really enjoying something that's not the diet food? All right, that got a little more response to it. You kind of understand. They're forfeiting some comforts in this situation. Daniel looks around and he says, if we're going to image God, we're not going to be able to enjoy what everyone else is enjoying. Now, the other people that's there, they could have looked at Daniel, and I'm sure there had to be some conversation with Daniel. Just eat it. What's the big deal? You're not in Jerusalem anymore. God has let you down. God is not taking care of you. God didn't keep you from being captive here. God has put you here. Why are you still trying to honor Him? Just eat. The man is giving you good food. Just eat it. But Daniel made a decision. I'm not going to defile myself with this. He also jeopardized the favor that he had. See, in this place, when Daniel got there, the Bible says God had put him in favor with the man that's in charge over top of them. Now, when Daniel comes up and says, look, I hate to bother you, but I'm really not comfortable eating this meat. You ever been uncomfortable trying to tell somebody you just can't do something? Like, I appreciate what you're offering us. I appreciate what you're giving me, but I'm going to have to decline. Daniel's risking in this country, in this place, losing the favor, the friendship, the advantage that he had had in this place. Sometimes, if we're going to image God, we're going to lose that influence we have with people. Here, let's take a look at it. Let's just say you have a job, you go to your job, everything's going okay, you don't want to ruffle the water. The boss says, we want everyone to do this, and all of a sudden you go, excuse me, I can't do that. Well, why can't you do that? Because I'm a Christian. That's not going to go well, is it? Hey, boss, I'm sorry, I can't fudge these numbers. I can't lie about this. I can't mislead this person in this. I can't cover for you because I am a Christian. Let's say you got a friend and the friend comes to you and they says, look, man, I told this person this. I need you to back me up on it. You go, I'm sorry. You're asking me to lie. Yeah, it's not a big deal. Just tell them. I can't lie for you. Why not? I would do it for you because I'm a Christian. If we're going to image God, we will risk jeopardizing our friendships and our influence. It's just going to be that way. But Daniel was willing to do it. Why? Because imaging God traveled, and now it's going to travail. Now, he also risked being at harm. Daniel could have been punished for what he's doing. But Daniel said, you know what? I think it's worth it. It's worth it to me because I am a Christian. And I image God. I represent God here on earth. And I cannot represent God here on earth while I'm taking part in these things that have paganism to them. I cannot do that. and he risked all of these things, but he's willing to do it. Let me ask the question, are you willing to risk these things in order to image God? Now and later. I've been talking about how we're living in what's becoming a post-Christian country. But it's not the way that everyone thinks it is, because everyone thinks, well, we're becoming post-Christian because of all these things that other people don't know. We're becoming post-Christian because of the way Christians are doing. We'll always be a Christian nation if Christians will be Christian. If Christians will image God. If Christians will be honest. If Christians will be humble. If Christians will be obedient. If Christians will be what we're supposed to be. So we can't blame our post-Christianism on the world. We have to look at ourselves and say, I'm responsible for this. Now, in all of these things, we've taken a look at, I want to look at the last one, imaging God triumph. That sounds better, right? When you talk about travail, that's just not fun at all. But triumph, that sounds like fun, right? It's not as fun as you might think it will be, because we will never triumph over our enemies until we image God before them. Think about that statement. We will never triumph over our enemies until we image God before them. What does that mean? Daniel's going to do great things. Matter of fact, Daniel is going to glorify God. There's going to be times when the king of Babylon, over the whole nation who worships idols, is going to say to people, pray to the God of Daniel. There's going to be a time when the king sets up an idol in order for everyone to worship. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, we're not going to be able to do that, and we'll take the consequences. We'll risk it all in order to honor God. And when he brings them out, he's going to say, I'm going to pass a law that everyone worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we never triumph in these situations until we first image God before them. If you want to change the situations happening in your world and your life, image God. Image God. You say, that's how I'm going to triumph over my enemies? It is, but not the way you think. Because triumph does not mean our enemies are destroyed or that we exalt or exalted over them. Isn't that disappointing? I mean, I just set you all up for triumphing and all of a sudden just say, it just doesn't mean that your enemies are going to be destroyed. Here's the thing I want you to understand. Daniel's going to glorify God, and people are going to see God and praise God and worship God because of Daniel, but his enemies are never going to be destroyed. Daniel is not going to become the king of Babylon. Daniel is not going to be restored to his home. Daniel is not going to see the release of his people back to their land. Imaging God and triumphing in that situation does not mean God's going to crush your enemies under your feet. It means that he's going to do something so much more. It means he's going to be glorified despite our enemies' attempts to ignore him. That's why I said, as Christians living in a post-Christian America, it's important for us to image God. It doesn't mean that we will turn this nation back to revival. It means that we will be able to glorify God even though people are ignoring him and disobeying him. What's the situation in your life that you're dealing with where you really need to image God and you're dealing with, and you say, God, if I handle this my way, I can get revenge. If I handle it your way, I'm not really sure how that's going to go. We'll never triumph over our enemies until we image God before them. Image God before them. I've been asking you over and over, like, you pray for the counseling ministry that we have here, and I talk about how so much of that deals with people that's not even a part of our church. And lately, I've talked to some people about situations in their life, and it's kind of come down to this. Here's what you need to do to image God. You have to make the choice. Are you willing to pay that price? And that's just the way our life is. So when we look at these things, we find out that in all of these things, God is glorified when we image him at all times and how? In every... Let's say that together. God is glorified when we image him at all times in every situation. What if Daniel and his friends had not decided to image God in this situation? God would not be glorified. Because see, what happens is Daniel says to his friend, to the person over him, he says, look, I'm willing to put everything at risk. Will you give me 10 days to test it? I believe that my God is going to work this out. I believe that God can If I'm trusting Him and doing this for the right reason, I believe that God will sustain me. And He says, just test it. Will you do it for 10 days? And then notice what He said. At the end of 10 days, if I'm not better, if we're not better than everyone else, if we're not as good as everyone else, we'll do it your way. But he trusted God enough to do that. What happened? At the end of it all, when the king has them stand before him, the Bible says he found them 10 times better than everyone else that he had in all of his kingdom. 10 times wiser, 10 times better. Why? Because he trusted God. And God used Daniel in a position. I'm going to skip ahead hundreds of years. We just came through Christmas, and so you have Christmas, you have the birth of Jesus Christ, we have the shepherds there, and then a couple years later, we have who showing up on the scene that comes from a far country? The wise men. Where's the far country they come from? Babylon. Why were people in Babylon, astrologers, wise men, looking for a new king to be born in Israel? Where did they learn about that from? Daniel's going to rise in the ranks, become the third in command, and leave a legacy about his God. And we have every reason to believe that that was passed down from generation to generation to generation, until one day those men look out and say, you know, that guy Daniel kept talking about that new king that was going to be born? We found his star. It all started because Daniel purposed in his heart, imaging God's going to travel with me wherever I go. It's not going to be geographical. It's not going to be based on my circumstances. It's going to be who I am and what I do. He's going to travail. He's going to make it hard. He's going to go through the difficulties. He's going to put things at risk in his life. How does Daniel end up in the lion's den? He's going to decide one day, you know what? I'm going to image God. I'm going to do what God has called me to do. And what happens at the end of that, when he brings Daniel out of it, he says, I want everyone to worship Daniel's God. All I want you to know today is that it is possible for us to change this world. It's possible for you to change the situation that you're in if you just purpose to worship and image God at all times and in every situation that you're in. Let's look at the application before we finish out everything. We'll make this kind of quick, so just kind of walk with me through it. Let me pull this back up. In your paper I gave you, you can take home with you to discuss this, write this, think through it, but I'm going to just kind of pose the questions to you at this time. Where do I fail to image God most often? Now, you know the answer to that question. Not where you don't know the answer where I fail most often. You know the answer to where you fail most often. And what I want you to do is take this home this week and look at it and say, God, where do I seem to have the biggest struggles imaging you? With whom do I fail to image God most often? That's a good question. What group am I around? What person am I around where I really don't image God? Is it the coworkers? Is it my best friends? Is it the people in my school? Is it my neighbors? Is it my family? What situation will I face this week that will challenge my effort to image God? What are you going to face? Some of you already, kind of, I know I got to deal with this week. I know I got to deal with this person this week. I got to deal with this situation this week. I really don't want to have to deal with that. Think through these things and then answer the last one. How will I make an effort to image God this week? That's what we do with these things as we learn them. We figure out how do we apply it in our life. Because if it's just a sermon, it doesn't travel, right? But if it's going to travel with us and we're going to image God in every situation and at all times, we need to think through sometimes, what am I going to face this week that is going to challenge me, and how will I deal with that? And who are the people? Through the years, we've had some people talk, sometimes come, they're dealing with things. And on several occasions, I've had people basically say, when I'm not with this group or I'm not with this person, I'm better. But whenever I get around them, it seems to be the trigger that I pull back into these things in my life. Then make a plan. Put some boundaries. Say, God, I'm going to image you. at all times, in every situation. So I'm going to put some boundaries in here. So, preacher, what about the people you can't avoid that's just going to come, they're going to push your buttons, they're going to do things? Image God at all times in every situation.